close your eyes and step back in time, into the marble corridors of a Roman villa at dusk. Oil lamps flicker, their light dancing across frescoed walls, while faint whispers drift through thin fabric partitions. Inside, Idumea and her slave girls murmur about tomorrow's beauty rituals. The air is thick with the fragrance of rose oil, mingling with burning incense, and something else, sharp, metallic, almost unsettling. From her private chambers, a senator's wife glides into view. Her face is masked in white lead, her lips painted crimson with mercury-based cosmetics, slow poison hidden beneath elegance. Every step she takes toward her husband's study is measured, graceful, yet heavy with the weight of customs so alien to us. They feel torn from fevered dreams rather than the pages of history. Before we descend into these long-forgotten stories of desire, survival, and suffering, if you hunger for the darker, hidden truths of history, make sure to like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It amazes me that, across oceans and centuries, we're sharing these same ancient shadows together. Because in Rome, what we call intimacy today, private moments, the quiet rituals of lovers, the bonds of family, existed inside frameworks so radically different they shatter everything we think we know about human nature. These weren't strange outliers in Roman life. They were the norm, stitched into the very fabric of society. Law, religion, and tradition didn't just allow them. They reinforced them, creating a civilization where power, gender, and sexuality followed rules that would both horrify and mesmerize us today. In 79 AD, when Mount Vesuvius swallowed Pompeii in its cloud of ash, it preserved far more than buildings and bodies. It entombed the intimate secrets of a city, bedrooms painted with explicit frescoes, bathhouses layered with complex social hierarchies, and private chambers where the lines between pleasure, pain, and power dissolved entirely. Consider the Roman ideal of pudicitia. We translate it as chastity or modesty, but for Roman women, it meant something far more intricate. It was the delicate art of balancing availability with restraint, dictated not by personal choice, but by status. A senator's wife, for example, was expected to be fully available to her husband, yet utterly unreachable to any other man, not as a matter of virtue, but as a living symbol of her husband's honor and political influence. Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus, embodied this balance so flawlessly that she became the living blueprint for Roman feminine virtue. But behind the marble mask of modesty, whispers claimed she ran a quiet web of informants. Slave girls planted in the households of Rome's most powerful families, feeding her intelligence on the private indulgences of her husband's political enemies. In Rome, she knew the most dangerous weapon was not the sword but the bedroom secret. Marriage in the Roman elite was no tender fairy tale. It was a calculated transaction. Families bartered daughters and sons to cement alliances, stack fortunes, and produce heirs whose legitimacy was beyond dispute. Love, if it bloomed, was an afterthought, a pleasant accident, never the foundation. Often, the wedding night was the first time bride and groom found themselves alone. The stakes were immense. Consummation wasn't merely personal, it was political. Pliny the Younger, in a letter penned in 97 AD, recalled one such night. A girl of barely 14, shivering in anticipation, stood as her mother and aunts prepared her for the ritual that would end her childhood in a single evening and bind her to a man she had barely spoken to. Her husband, 20 years her elder, waited in the adjoining chamber as the older women murmured instructions she could scarcely grasp. The marriage bed had already been sanctified, blessed by the household gods, sprinkled with sacred water, and dressed in crimson-dyed fabrics, chosen to conceal the blood that would mark the end of her virgin innocence. Roman sexual customs were not simply about men. They revolved around rigid categories of status. Citizen, non-citizen, slave, freedman, foreigner, each occupied a rung in a social order that dictated not just class, but who could touch whom and under what terms. A Roman citizen man could bed slaves, prostitutes, or foreigners without fear of scandal. But to cross the boundary into the bedroom of another citizen's wife or daughter, that was an act that could end in ruin or worse. Gaius Silius learned this in 48 AD, when he dared to wed Valeria Messalina, the wife of Emperor Claudius, while the emperor was away from Rome. Whether the union was lawful was irrelevant. In the eyes of the empire, the gesture alone was treason, an open defiance of imperial power, and an insult that could not go unanswered. When Claudius returned, both Silius and Messalina were put to death, not for mere adultery, but for a crime far greater, shattering the political order through their forbidden union. In Rome, sexual scandal could be treason. Slavery added yet another layer to this web of power and desire. Household slaves were not seen as people in their own right, but as extensions of their master's body, permanently available for use, without consent, without protection, and without recourse. Among the elite, wealth bought specialization. Some slaves were kept for beauty treatments, others, cubicularia, for the intimate duties of the bedroom. Concubines often lived in a shadow marriage, their role entirely sexual, yet woven into the fabric of the household. Marcus Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome's history, was said to have kept over 500 slaves in his city residence. Dozens of them were chosen for their physical perfection, trained not just to serve, but to seduce. Ancient writers whispered of lavish evening gatherings, where such slaves would perform music, recite poetry, and offer services that blurred every line between art, worship, and exploitation. Evenings in certain Roman households unfolded like performances, slaves offering not just music and poetry, but far more intimate services, dissolving the boundaries between entertainment, ritual, and exploitation. Beyond the private home, Rome's bathing culture provided another stage where desire and status mingled under watchful eyes. Bathhouses were more than places to cleanse the body. They were hubs of social life, where conversations shifted from politics to seduction in the same breath. The rules were unspoken, the boundaries carefully managed. Men and women usually bathed apart, yet the mingling in corridors, gardens, and waiting rooms often sparked arrangements destined to be completed in private. Seneca the Younger, writing around 60 AD, painted the scene with weary irritation. The clanging of weights, the wet slap of flesh under a masseur's hands, the sharp cries of those plucked bare by tweezers, and beneath it all, the low murmur of bargains struck between bathers and attendants for pleasures never posted on any public wall. Seneca's irritation peeled back the curtain on a truth the Romans barely bothered to hide. Commercial sex was so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life that it flourished in public institutions without shame. Their obsession with grooming bordered on the fanatical, especially among the elite. Body hair, to them, was something to be conquered, burned, plucked, or scraped away. Men and women alike submitted to painful rituals. Heated bronze tweezers snapping at the skin, sticky pine resin waxes ripped away, without mercy, or coarse pumice stones grinding hair from the flesh. The wealthy kept slaves whose sole purpose was this cruel art, alipolarii, the silent executioners of unwanted hair. Martial, the sharp-tongued poet from Spain, once recounted watching a senator's wife endure such a session, her dignity traded for the smooth, perfect skin demanded by Roman taste. She did not flinch. Lying perfectly still, the senator's wife allowed her slave girl to work in silence, heated bronze tweezers glinting in the light. One by one, the hairs were plucked from her arms, her legs, and the most intimate parts of her body. A Roman matron was expected to endure such ordeals without complaint. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but she made no sound. Pain was acceptable, weakness was not. The session lasted for hours. When it was finally over, her skin was red, tender, and bleeding in places. Yet to Roman eyes, it was flawless, proof of status and refinement. But beauty in Rome often came at a fatal cost. The pale, porcelain faces of noblewomen were achieved with powders laced with lead carbonate, a poison that seeped slowly into the body, corroding the nervous system, causing infertility, madness, and death. Rouge, painted thick upon lips and cheeks, was made from mercury compounds that brought a vivid glow even as they destroyed the brain. Black coal liners, darkening the eyes to an alluring depth, contained antimony and other deadly metals. In his Ars Amatoria, written around 2 AD, Ovid provided instructions that, to modern eyes, read more like alchemical recipes for slow suicide. Mix white lead with vinegar into a silky paste and smear it thick over the face and neck. For lips, grind cinnabar with rose oil and animal fat. For the eyes, blend antimony with honey and wine. Women chasing these ideals were, quite literally, painting themselves to death, sacrificing decades of life for the fleeting approval of fashion. Roman methods of birth control and abortion were just as perilous. Contraception often relied on substances and rituals far deadlier than pregnancy itself. One of the most prized was silphium, a plant so effective that it was stamped on coins and traded for its weight in silver. Harvested to extinction from the Libyan coast, it was taken in potent doses that could easily kill. Cyrano's of Ephesus, a Greek physician practicing in Rome in the 2nd century AD, recorded other disturbing methods. Some women inserted wool soaked in honey, cedar resin, or vinegar before intercourse. Others swallowed concoctions of copper sulfate, iron rust, or even powdered beetles. There were those who tried to ward off conception with punishing exercise, scalding baths, or deliberate falls. His writings carry a cold, clinical tone, but behind them is the unmistakable desperation of women gambling with their lives for control over their bodies in a world that gave them few rights and fewer choices. Abortion, while generally legal under Roman law, was no less dangerous. The fetus was seen as part of the mother's body, not a separate life. Yet the crude and brutal procedures available often claimed the life of the woman herself. Roman women sometimes resorted to deadly measures in their fight to end an unwanted pregnancy. Toxic plants like pennyroyal, rue, and savon were ingested to induce miscarriage, herbs that worked not by targeting the fetus, but by poisoning the entire body. Others faced even greater risks, submitting to mechanical procedures with cold bronze instruments that could tear the womb, trigger massive hemorrhaging, or leave fatal infections festering within. Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History around 77 AD, recounts one such tragedy. A wealthy matron, desperate after days of swallowing one herbal concoction after another with no effect, finally placed her fate in the hands of a Greek physician. She bit down on a leather strap while her female relatives held her still as the doctor inserted instruments deep into her. The operation succeeded in ending the pregnancy, yet within days, infection spread through her body. She died in searing agony, her family quietly telling neighbors it was a fever, unwilling to admit the truth. In matters of sexuality, Rome's morality was not governed by romance or emotional connection, but by dominance and social hierarchy. Homosexual relationships between men were not only tolerated, but sometimes celebrated, so long as the rules of status were respected. A freeborn Roman citizen could take the active role with slaves, foreigners, or anyone beneath his rank without scandal. But to be on the receiving end, regardless of personal desire or mutual consent, was seen as the ultimate humiliation, a shame so profound it could tarnish a man's honor and even bring legal consequences. Julius Caesar lived his entire career under the shadow of a rumor that refused to die. Whispers claimed that, as a young man, he had taken a passive role in an affair with Nicomedes, IV of Bithynia. His rivals seized on the story, mocking him as the Queen of Bithynia, and hinting that his later military triumphs were nothing more than an attempt to bury the shame of that supposed submission. Truth mattered little. What counted was the insult. In Roman eyes, a man who allowed himself to be sexually dominated forfeited the moral authority to rule. Centuries later, Emperor Hadrian's devotion to the striking youth Antinous stirred similar controversy. The scandal was not rooted in the fact that the emperor loved another man. Rome could accept that, but in the depth of his visible attachment. To many, it hinted that Hadrian had surrendered the emotional upper hand, yielding the dominance expected of a ruler of the world's greatest empire. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130 AD, Hadrian's grief knew no bounds. He did what no Roman emperor before him had dared. He declared the youth a god and founded an entire city in his name. To many Romans, such public devotion was not an act of imperial strength, but an undignified display of romantic weakness. Meanwhile, prostitution in Rome was far from a shadowy underground. It operated within clear legal boundaries, with workers classified by rank and status. Meretresses were registered prostitutes, plying their trade in licensed brothels and paying taxes on their earnings. Ancilli were enslaved women, hired out by their owners for sexual services. Famosi, women of respectable birth, had fallen from grace through scandal or adultery and drifted into the world of informal prostitution. The ruins of Pompeii preserve these lives in haunting detail. Brothels consisted of narrow stone rooms, scarcely big enough for a single bed, their walls painted with vivid frescoes depicting sexual acts and posted prices. Clients left behind graffiti, names, crude reviews, and, on rare occasions, messages of tenderness. One inscription reads simply, "Restituta, the delight of my heart. You have such a sweet way of moving your hips." A fragment of graffiti, scrawled 2,000 years ago, hints that even in Rome's commercial sex trade, moments of genuine human connection could flicker into life. The Subura district was the beating heart of the city's pleasures, an unending maze of brothels, taverns, and noisy entertainment halls. It was here that wealthy men slipped into disguise, exchanging silken togas for coarse tunics, hiding their senatorial rings deep in their purses. The poet Juvenal, writing around 100 AD, painted the scene vividly: senators, magistrates, even priests, stealing through the streets after dark. By morning, they would return to their marble villas, their public dignity carefully restored, as though the night's indulgences belonged to another realm, under the jurisdiction of different gods. For Rome's elite, even marriage itself could be a carefully negotiated contract rather than a romantic union. Wealthy couples often signed documents, etched into papyrus or engraved on bronze, that detailed not only dowries and property rights, but also the rules of the bedroom. They might specify the required frequency of intimacy, the approved methods of contraception, and the financial or social penalties for straying into the arms of another. In the Roman world, love and law were never far apart, and sometimes the law had the final word. A marriage contract dated to 134 AD, binding two of Rome's most powerful families, contains a clause as coldly precise as any trade agreement. The wife shall submit to her husband's desires no fewer than twice a week, unless hindered by illness, menstruation, or the rites of purification. She shall not refuse unusual requests unless they cause bodily harm or demand the presence of others. Failure to comply will result in deductions from her dowry. For the Roman elite, even the wedding night was steeped in symbolism and ritual. The bride was lifted over the threshold, a gesture meant to block malevolent spirits from slipping in through her feet. Her hair was styled with a spear that had once slain a gladiator, a grim talisman meant to infuse her with the courage she would need to face the dangers of childbirth. The marriage bed was consecrated by matrons who had known only one husband and born children still living, a living emblem of marital virtue. Around them, young boys scattered handfuls of nuts and ripe fruit, tokens meant to summon fertility to the union. Catullus, in his wedding hymn for Unia and Manlius around 60 BC, painted the scene before the couple's first night together. The bride sat in silence, while elder women removed the garments of her childhood, replacing them with a saffron-colored gown of matrimony. Her face was painted with sacred clay, her hair tied with ribbons blessed by the household gods. Her tears were not of sorrow, but of fear of the unknown transformation awaiting her. In the next room, the groom drank wine with his male kin, their voices low, offering counsel that veered from the coarse to the tender, instructing him on the duties that must be fulfilled before the first light of dawn. In Rome's upper classes, divorce could be declared by either spouse with nothing more than a formal announcement. Yet the consequences were far from equal. A man could cast aside his wife, suffer little more than raised eyebrows, and remarry the very next day. For women, the cost was far harsher: social exile, the likely loss of their children, and crushing financial ruin, as the law almost always favored the husband in disputes over property. In 18 BC, Augustus tried to rein in these dissolutions with his Lex Aelia de Maritandis Ordinibus, a law compelling men to marry and punishing those who remained bachelors or divorced without cause. But the plan backfired spectacularly. A black market for sham marriages emerged, and the wealthy devised ingenious loopholes to sidestep the emperor's demands. Some men found loopholes in Augustus' marriage laws by wedding slave women only to free them moments later, while others took foreign brides from distant provinces, women they would never lay eyes on again. Roman religious life itself often blurred the line between piety and pleasure. Festivals could erupt into displays of sexuality that would leave modern audiences stunned. Each April, the Floralia honored the goddess Flora with riotous celebration, nude dancing, body theatrical performances, and even public coupling, all meant to entice the earth into renewed fertility. Respectable matrons kept their distance, but prostitutes, slaves, and freed women joined in with unrestrained abandon. The poet Martial himself wrote of attending the Floralia in 88 AD, bearing witness to its brazen excess. The theater swelled with citizens who would denounce such spectacles within the walls of their own homes. Yet here, they roared in approval as naked dancers performed scenes that would make a brothel blush. Senators lounged beside slaves, all maintaining the polite fiction that piety, not curiosity, had drawn them to watch couples unite on stage to the sound of sacred hymns. The goddess Flora, they claimed, blessed only those who shed every trace of modesty, and on these nights, the crowd seemed determined to secure her favor. Roman medical writings reveal a world where science and social order were inseparably entwined. Physicians like Galen documented human anatomy and sexual function with meticulous detail, yet their advice often upheld social hierarchies more than medical truth. They insisted that women must experience pleasure to conceive, but warned that too much pleasure would corrupt them, rendering them immoral and impossible to control. Cyrenus of Ephesus left behind instructions for midwives that offer a striking glimpse into how the Romans linked sexuality with childbirth. If labor dragged on, the midwife was to ask, had the woman found satisfaction at the moment of conception? For in Roman thought, pleasure opened the womb and eased the child's descent. Without it, herbs or manual intervention might be required. A child conceived in passion, they believed, entered the world more readily. But when conception came through duty or through violence, labor was harder, longer, and fraught with pain. For Roman youth, sexual education was not a single lesson, but a lifelong drip of knowledge, part taught openly, part absorbed from the very air they breathed, beginning in childhood and continuing into the turbulent years of adolescence. Boys absorbed their lessons in sexuality from older male relatives, household tutors, and, often, from direct encounters with slaves. For girls, instruction came from their mothers and married women, but the focus was on endurance, obedience, and the quiet acceptance of a husband's will, rather than any notion of choice or pleasure. When a Roman boy reached 16, the toga virilis marked his passage into manhood. The ceremony blended sacred and social rites, offerings to the household gods, public declarations of adulthood, and behind closed doors, frank instruction on sexual conduct. Archaeology suggests that such guidance sometimes took the form of visits to brothels or arranged encounters with seasoned slaves. Roman poetry cracks open another window into this world. The poet Catullus poured his soul into verses about his lover Lesbia, likely Clodia Metelli, sister to a powerful politician, charting the dizzying highs of passion and the crushing lows of jealousy. Though marriage was a political contract, not a love match, the emotions in his poems are instantly familiar: desire, heartbreak, longing. Yet even in his most vulnerable lines, Catullus speaks from within a culture that framed love and lust through the lens of hierarchy and power. Catullus once praised Lesbia's sharp mind and effortless charm. But when love curdled into betrayal, his words turned venomous. His verses became weapons, threatening to violate her male companions, using sexual domination as a form of revenge. In Rome, love was never far from power, and even the most tender bonds could sour into cruelty when the social order felt threatened. Even in death, intimacy was staged and displayed. Roman funerary art often showed husbands and wives reclining together for eternity, the wife's hand resting gently on her husband's chest, a silent promise that fidelity and union outlast the grave. At times, a master might grant freedom to a cherished slave in order to marry them, but love in Rome could never be entirely free of the chains that had forged it. Even then, the shadow of ownership lingered. Children born to enslaved women were, by law, the property of the master, no matter who their father was. Families could be split apart at a whim. Pliny the Younger once wrote to a friend about the loss of his slave, Zosmus. "He was more than a servant to me. He shared my bed, my table, my secrets. When he fell ill, I refused to leave his care to others. I nursed him myself. Now his absence has carved an emptiness into my home that nothing can fill. I have freed his son and commissioned a tomb, not naming Zosmus as my property, but as my beloved friend." Some will say this is too much affection for a mere slave. Roman law offered several paths to marriage, each carrying its own weight. Conferiatio, the most sacred and formal, reserved for patricians, bound husband and wife with elaborate religious rites, making divorce all but impossible. Coemptio was a symbolic purchase, transferring a bride from her father's power to her husband's. And usus created marriage simply through a year of shared life under one roof. If a woman lived under a man's roof for an entire year, without leaving for 3 consecutive nights, the law recognized them as husband and wife. These forms of marriage created a vast spectrum of intimacy, each offering different degrees of legal protection and social standing. Among Rome's elite, conferiatio was the prized choice, its sacred rituals ensuring absolute legitimacy and unshakable inheritance rights. For the poor, marriage was often forged through usus, simple cohabitation with no ceremony, no paperwork, and far fewer legal safeguards. Roman sexuality, too, was a world apart from modern sensibilities. Behaviors that would shock today's audiences were, in their time, woven into the fabric of daily life. One such practice was pederasty, sexual relationships between grown men and adolescent boys. In Rome, it was not merely tolerated but often celebrated, so long as strict social codes were observed. In these arrangements, the adult was expected to take the dominant role, not only in the physical relationship, but as a mentor shaping the boy's mind in literature, politics, and culture. To Roman eyes, it was an education. To modern understanding, it was a relationship steeped in power imbalances, where the line between guidance and exploitation was impossible to ignore. Roman authors left behind vivid portraits of such bonds. In his Satyricon, written around 60 AD, Petronius captures the narrator's tangled emotions toward his young lover, Giton. "The boy's beauty tormented me more than it pleased me. I longed to possess him entirely, to claim not just his body, but his thoughts, his dreams. Yet when other men's eyes lingered on him, I felt not pride, but a cold fear that they might steal what I believed was mine. Love blurred into possession, and I could no longer tell if I was his protector or his jailer." Even Rome's religious life sometimes wove sexuality into its rituals, acts believed to secure divine favor or protection. In certain temples, sexuality was not hidden, it was sanctified. Sacred prostitutes served as living bridges between mortal worshippers and the divine. Among the most striking of these cults was the worship of Cybele, beloved by soldiers and merchants. Her rituals could be as violent as they were ecstatic. In a frenzy of devotion, male priests would castrate themselves, shedding their former identities to live as women in the service of the goddess. These Galli stood apart from the Roman order, neither man nor woman, neither citizen nor slave. They existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary life, belonging instead to the sacred realm. Magic, too, was often entwined with desire. Archaeologists have uncovered scores of cursed tablets, desperate invocations for divine intervention in matters of the heart. One pleads, "I bind Gaius Lucius so that he can think of nothing but Claudia, so that he cannot eat, cannot sleep, cannot rest, until he comes to her bed." Love potions, brewed from plants and animals both exotic and deadly, were openly sold despite laws forbidding them. In Rome, the line between medicine, magic, and poison was perilously thin, and many paid for beauty or passion with their lives. When it came to sexual pleasure, Rome drew sharp distinctions, especially between men and women. In Rome, men were expected to chase pleasure, boldly, openly, and without shame, so long as they preserved their status and dominance. Indulgence was not a flaw, but almost a mark of manhood. For women, the rules were far more treacherous. They were expected to enjoy enough intimacy to conceive, but never so much that it hinted at unrestrained passion or infidelity. The line between virtue and vice was razor thin, and a single misstep could ruin a reputation. This constant balancing act bred quiet anxiety. A wife who seemed too cold risked displeasing her husband. Too warm, and she might be branded a wanton. Roman writers were keen observers of this tension. In Amores, penned around 15 BC, Ovid paints a scene. She lay beneath me like a statue, dutiful but joyless, afraid that showing desire would brand her as shameless. Yet when I stopped, she wept, believing her chill had failed to please me. For Roman wives, marriage was a narrow strait between two dangers, the Scylla of excessive desire and the Charybdis of indifference, and many found themselves wrecked upon one shore or the other. In Rome, the management of a household extended far beyond food, finances, and decorum. It reached into the most intimate aspects of life, even controlling the sexuality of slaves. A master could forbid slave marriages, tear apart families, and grant or withhold sexual access as a tool of reward or punishment. Some elite households went further still, running deliberate breeding programs to produce children with desired physical strength or sharp intellect. The surviving records, etched in wax tablets and inked on papyrus, read less like human histories and more like livestock registries. They laid bare the brutal truth. In the Roman mind, these men, women, and children were property before they were people. The military, too, had its own sexual codes, reflecting both the tight-knit, all-male world of the legions and the raw power imbalance between conqueror and conquered. Soldiers were officially expected to remain celibate while on campaign, a rule broken as often as it was spoken. Rape, concubinage, and liaisons with local women were common, and victory itself often came with a dark, unspoken prize. In the wake of conquest, mass rape of female captives was not considered a crime, but an ancient entitlement of war. Caesar himself alludes to such customs. After the siege of Alesia, he writes, "The legions celebrated their victory according to ancient tradition," a phrase that hides as much as it reveals. The women captured in battle were divided among the victors. Officers took their pick, common soldiers claimed the rest. Some were put to work as servants. Others were taken for purposes that Roman military law normally forbade, but in the glow of triumph, those rules fell silent. That night, the camp was alive with two sounds: the jubilant songs of victory and the muffled screams of the conquered. Together, they formed a chilling harmony, music that revealed Rome's dual soul, a builder of civilization and an unflinching destroyer. Even in peacetime, Roman ideas about sex and power were etched into stone and mortar. In public buildings, entrances and spaces were carefully divided for men and women. In private homes, architecture itself enforced hierarchy, each doorway and corridor controlling who could pass, who could see, and who could touch. The innermost chambers, reserved for intimacy, were adorned with frescoes and mosaics celebrating fertility, pleasure, and at times, violence. And beyond the walls, the famous Roman roads carried more than legions and merchants. They were lifelines for a different kind of commerce. Prostitutes, slaves, and entertainers moved from city to city, following the currents of festivals, military victories, and trade. Along the empire's vast network of roads, many inns offered more than a bed and a meal. In dim back rooms and curtained alcoves, they doubled as brothels, places where traveling merchants could expect pleasure to be as readily available as food or wine. Rome's lawmakers understood that sex was not merely a personal indulgence. It was a force to be managed, taxed, and shaped to serve the state. The legal code laid out with cold precision which acts were permitted, who could share a bed with whom, and the punishments for those who crossed the line. These laws did not exist to protect individuals from harm, but to protect the structure of Roman society, to safeguard bloodlines, enforce hierarchies, and preserve the delicate order on which the empire rested. Even the imperial treasury found profit in desire. Prostitutes were required to pay licensing fees and taxes on every coin they earned. Brothel owners surrendered a portion of their income to the state. Even private citizens caught in adultery could find themselves paying heavy fines, turning scandal into revenue. In Rome, sex was never just a private act. It was an industry, a machine woven into the economy itself. And Roman ingenuity ensured the physical world reflected this truth. Bathhouses were built not only for cleansing the body, but for indulgence. Behind steam-filled chambers, discreet rooms waited for couples to meet unseen. In the grand theaters of Rome, entertainment wasn't confined to the stage. High above the crowd, in the shadowed upper galleries, another kind of performance unfolded, one the authorities knew about, yet chose not to see. Even the sacred was not immune. Some temples contained hidden chambers where worshippers could honor the gods through sexual rites. believing passion itself was a form of devotion. Roman art captured this world without shame or restraint. Frescoes, mosaics, sculptures, and everyday objects preserved moments of raw intimacy in scenes so explicit they would be condemned as obscene in later centuries. Yet for the Romans, such images were a natural part of life, adorning villas, taverns, and bathhouses without a hint of embarrassment. These surviving works reveal a truth that unsettles modern sensibilities. The Romans lived in a world far more open and far less shy about sexuality than most European cultures that followed. Roman thinkers wrestled with the same questions that still stir debate today about desire, pleasure, and what it means to live well. The Stoics, champions of discipline, preached restraint. To them, unchecked passion was a flaw, a chain that bound the mind and clouded judgment. The Epicureans saw the matter differently. Pleasure, they believed, was a natural part of life, but it was not to be chased recklessly. The wise sought joys that brought peace and shunned those that ended in pain or turmoil. In these opposing visions, Rome left us a timeless reminder. The struggle between indulgence and self-mastery is as old as civilization itself. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, spent his life balancing Stoic ideals against the pull of human desire. To him, the body's craving for pleasure was like water seeking its own level, always flowing toward instant gratification. The mind, he believed, must stand like a dam, not to block the current entirely, but to guide it toward what serves the greater good. Desire was not evil nor shameful. Like fire, it could warm and illuminate, or, left untamed, it could devour everything in its path. Roman medicine, too, approached sexuality with a mix of knowledge and myth. Their physicians possessed an impressive grasp of anatomy, understood the mechanics of reproduction, and even performed surgical procedures to treat sexual injuries and infections. Yet these insights were often entangled with cultural beliefs and superstitions, some harmless, others dangerously wrong. Yet Roman medicine was never entirely free from the weight of cultural bias. Treatments often reflected ideas about gender, social status, and morality, beliefs that shaped both diagnosis and prescription. Even the fields were not untouched by these notions. Roman farmers held that human sexuality could influence the fertility of the earth itself. Planting and harvest were sometimes timed to align with the farmers' own intimate lives. Agricultural manuals, blending superstition with practical instruction, advised couples on when and how to engage in sex during different seasons, believing such acts could transfer human fertility to the crops through sympathetic magic. Entertainment, too, carried a charge of sexuality woven seamlessly into the spectacle. Gladiatorial games, theater, chariot races, and public festivals were not only arenas of sport and drama, but also places of titillation. Many performers doubled as sex workers, and the venues themselves became meeting grounds for those seeking pleasure as much as diversion. The literature of Rome preserved these currents of desire and emotion. Poets like Catullus, Ovid, Propertius, and Martial painted vivid portraits of love, jealousy, loss, and longing, works at once deeply personal and unmistakably Roman, revealing the private passions that thrived within their public work. Religion, too, was touched by these forces. As Rome absorbed Egypt, Greece, Syria, and the Germanic lands, it also absorbed their sexual symbols and sacred rites. Temples and festivals became places where foreign deities mingled with Roman gods, and with them came rituals both enriching and unsettling, complicating the already intricate fabric of Roman sexuality. Mystery cults like those of Mithras, Isis, and Dionysus offered visions of sexuality far removed from the rigid codes of traditional Rome. Their rituals, shrouded in secrecy, promised transformation, yet sometimes clashed with the empire's moral order. In Rome's bustling economy, sex was not merely tolerated, it was business. Prostitution, concubinage, and other intimate trades were taxed, regulated, and, remarkably, protected by law. The state had a vested interest in keeping these services alive, not for moral reasons, but for the steady stream of revenue they brought. Here, economics often shaped attitudes more than religion ever could. Sex could open doors or slam them shut. A slave of exceptional beauty might earn freedom through a master's desire, while a freeborn citizen could tumble from grace in the wake of scandal. Strategic marriages elevated entire dynasties. A single indiscretion could end in exile, execution, or ruin. Even Roman innovation found its way into the bedroom. Archaeologists have uncovered devices and substances crafted to heighten pleasure, prevent conception, or restore lost vitality. Some were made from bronze and glass, others from organic materials now long vanished, silent witnesses to the intimate ingenuity of an empire. Roman pharmacology offered countless concoctions meant to stir passion, enhance performance, or influence fertility. But Rome's reach went far beyond medicine. It used sexuality as a weapon of empire. In conquered lands, sexual violence and control became deliberate tools of domination. Local populations were pushed to adopt Roman sexual norms, while being denied the very protections Romans claimed for themselves. Governors and soldiers routinely took native women as concubines, producing mixed descendants who blurred, and often troubled, the empire's legal and social order. Even in death, Roman views on sexuality lingered. Tomb inscriptions spoke of marriages destined to continue in the afterlife. Burial offerings sometimes included objects linked to intimacy. In some funeral rites, sexual acts were performed, not out of lust, but as rituals to ensure fertility or vitality beyond the grave. Now return, in your mind, to that marble corridor where our journey began. But this time, you hear the whispers clearly. You see the beauty treatments slowly poisoning wealthy women. You read marriage contracts that reduce intimacy to livestock breeding. You notice the slaves whose bodies were mere property, bought, sold, and used without consent. You watched children handed into marriages before they even knew what marriage was. You feel the weight of intricate social codes that dictated who could touch whom, when, and how. Rome gave the world roads, laws, literature, and architectural wonders that still command awe. But it also built systems of intimacy on bedrocks of inequality, exploitation, and violence. Realities that are hard for us to fully grasp. The Romans weren't monsters. They were people, bound by cultural norms that felt as inevitable to them as our own customs do to us. The volcanic ash that froze Pompeii in time preserved more than streets and buildings. It captured a mirror. And when we look into it, we see the uneasy truth. Human sexuality has always been entwined with power, politics, and hierarchy. The bodies lying in their final poses, their private lives sealed in ash, whisper across the centuries. They speak not in Latin, but in the timeless language of desire, entangled with cruelty. They remind us that intimacy has never been innocent, that love has never been untouched by power, and that every society's sexual customs reveal its deepest beliefs about who is fully human and who is not. Stand in those ruins long enough, and you can almost hear them, ancient voices carrying secrets buried but never dead. They've only learned new tongues and adopted new disguises, and their echoes remain, as enduring and unsettling as the human heart itself.